Welcome back to Tax UK with myself, Adam Hill. Today we're going to be looking at how you complete the employment section of the self-assessment tax return. I'm going to show you on screen the entries that you'll actually need to make if you are completing a tax return and you had employment income during that tax year. I'm also going to explain who actually needs to complete this section of the return, so you'll actually know if this applies to you or not. Because it might seem odd to provide HMRC with details of your employment income, as typically, if you're employed, then you're going to pay tax through your employment. It's known as the PAYE system or pay as you earn. So you might be wondering, why do HMRC need to know about it again? And the truth is, they don't actually need to know about it again. They already know exactly what you earn and they know how much tax you've already paid, because your employer has already submitted reports that tell them all of that information. In fact, if you leave details of an employment off of a return, you'll often get a reminder from HMRC that their records differ from yours, essentially giving you a nudge to add that onto your return. So the real reason you need to enter details of your employment income isn't to inform HMRC, it's just to ensure that that employment income is included in your tax calculation. You won't usually pay any more tax on your employment income most of the time, but your employment income will usually impact how much tax you pay on other sources of income, such as self-employed income or rental income. An example of this is if you earn £20,000 from employment and then £10,000 from rental income, then your rental income is effectively going to be taxed at 20%. In that same scenario though, if you change the employment income to £70,000, then your rental income of £10,000 will actually get taxed at 40%. So before you can calculate how much tax you owe on additional sources of income, first you'll need to know how much employment income you had and how much tax you paid on that employment income. This is why most people out there who need to enter employment income on their tax return will be entering it alongside another source of income, like rental income or self-employed income. However, it is worth noting that anyone in the UK with income totaling over £100,000 from all sources has to complete a self-assessment tax return. So if your income from employment on its own is over £100,000, then even where that's your only source of income, you would usually need to complete a tax return anyway. This is because once you reach £100,000 of income, your personal allowance starts to get taken away. And that's not something that the PAYE system can actually deal with. And it means that you would need to complete a tax return. And ultimately, you're likely to have an additional tax liability in that scenario. Now, hopefully you understand why you need to include employment income on a self-assessment tax return. I'm now going to show you how to include it on the tax return. So to tell HMRC about your employment income, you'll first need to inform them under the Tailor Your Return section. It's the first question and it says, you'll see a reminder here, our record shows that you may have had employments in this tax year. So even before I've told them, you know HMRC are already aware of this income. You're essentially just reconfirming those details. So on page 1 of 3 under the Tailor Your Return section, we have a question: were you an employee or director or office holder or agency worker in the year to the 5th of April 2022? I'm completing the 21-22 tax return here. So an employee and agency worker are both quite self-explanatory. You will know if you are either of these. But also we have to detail if we are a director or office holder. Now, director is normally someone in charge of running a company, often a limited company. You could be the sole director. There could be many directors, but you may need to inform HMRC if that is the case. An office holder is typically somebody like a secretary or treasurer, could be involved with a community project like a sports club or a charity maybe. And often these two positions, directors and office holders, they could be paid positions as well. If you're an employee or an agency worker, you're going to be getting paid for your time. If you are a director or office holder, it could be that you hold those positions, but you aren't actually paid anything for them. You don't receive a salary. Now, you only need to inform HMRC if you are a director and you're receiving a salary, or if you are an office holder and you're receiving a salary. So just bear that in mind. In this example, I'm going to say yes to being an employee, and I'll be prompted to tell HMRC or remind them, because they already know, how many employments I had during that tax year. I'm going to select one in this example, but if you did have more than one employment in a tax year, maybe you left one employment partway through and you started another, remember that's going to be 2 employments, and you'd need to give details of that here. Now, if you think about it, yes, we are just confirming information that HMRC already know, but they're probably using this information as a check. Essentially, if you told them you had 2 employments and they only had you down as having 1, then it's probably a good check for them to make sure that the employers at their end are submitting all the information they need to and paying across all the tax that they actually owe HMRC, because they could then go and investigate this employer that you've told them you had but hasn't reported any information to them. So it's almost like a cross-check for them. You need to provide the name of your employment, so I'll just put example limited here. It's always a good idea to use official documentation to grab the name and all the details. So a pay slip is a good place to get the name from. Quite often the name that you refer to your employer as might not be their official trading name or their registered name with HMRC. So try to use a pay slip, use a P45 is a document you get if you leave employment partway through a tax year, or a P60 if you're still employed with the same employer come the 5th of April, the end of a tax year, then every employee would get a P60 and contains all of these details that you're going to need. So try to keep those to hand. P45 or P60 are your go-tos. Now that's the only information I need to provide on the tailor your return section. But now if I jump to if I save and continue and I jump to the fill in your return, I do have other sections generated on my tax return, but you'll see here we have a new section that's generated because it's grayed out. I haven't entered any information here yet. And this is where we need to provide details of that employment. And you can jump to it by clicking on the blue link to enter income. Now we've already got the name of the employer, example limited, which again you'll get from your official documentation. The employer PAYE reference will look something like this. Again, just grab that from your P45 or P60. All of these details should be taken directly from those forms so you get the exact figures. Remember, we're just confirming information that HMRC already have. The pay from your employment will come straight from P45 or P60. I'll put £35,000 in this case. What you might notice is that if you do put the exact figure, so maybe I had 0.65, an extra 65 pence, HMRC or the form will normally round that down to the nearest pound. That's in your favour though, so any rounding differences are going to be in your favour. They're not rounding it up so you pay more tax on that income. The amount of tax will also get entered here. And then we've got an entry for tips and other payments that are not on your P60. Typically, this will apply to service workers. Maybe if you're a waiter and you're working in a restaurant and you receive tips, you might have to include that in income on your tax return. Really what they're looking for is any income that you haven't paid tax on. Now that can be a bit tricky if you are working in the service industry, maybe as a waiter, because sometimes your employer will collect all your tips for you. In that case, they then become responsible for deducting tax from it and paying that across to HMRC. so you wouldn't need to declare it again because it would already get included in your gross pay. But if you did receive any payments, maybe £10–20 here, technically you're supposed to include that information, any untaxed income here. Were you a director of this company? We already know that directors are the people charged with running companies. So if you're just working and receiving a salary like most people, then you're likely to not be a director. But if you are running your own company, your own limited company, then that one may apply to you, and you may have to provide additional details of the company. Is this employment income from inside off-payroll working engagements? So I'm going to say no. This usually applies to contractors, so more common in London and bigger cities, IT workers, oil and gas workers, that type of thing. They'll often work short-term contracts that might last for 6 or 12 months. They'll get paid £300, £400, £500 a day, and they're talking, and that's what these rules IR35 normally apply to. But if you're just an employee, then it's not going to apply to you. Have you received any taxable benefits and expense payments from Example Limited? I'll say no, but if you do have a company car, if they provide you with accommodation, if they pay for your fuel, medical insurance, that type of thing, then often that's known as a taxable benefit or a P11D benefit, and you have to pay tax on that income as well, or it's deemed to be income, so it becomes taxable. But you would normally receive, again, official documentation from your employer, a P11D showing all the expenses that they had paid on your behalf, and then it would provide you with a taxable amount. I'll say yes, actually, to that question, so you can see what it looks like if you do have that. And then finally, do you wish to claim any employment expenses or capital allowances while working for your employer? So there are certain examples or certain situations where you can reclaim expenses that you have incurred on your employer's behalf. I've got a video about this on the channel, so go and check it out. But certain things like travel expenses, if you have to pay fuel to go and travel to clients, if you have to stay overnight, if you have to incur certain food expenses, subsistence whilst you're traveling, then they are normally allowable as an employee, and you can claim them as a deduction against your employment income. So again, I'll just say yes to show you what it actually looks like, and then save and continue. So first of all, these are the taxable benefits. Again, you would have completed, or your employer would have completed a P11D, and you would have got a copy of this. So you might have a company car that is worth £5,000 a year. They might pay your fuel, which totals £2,000. Medical insurance might be £500. You would be taking these figures directly from that P11D. And again, they will apply a figure to everything. So I'm going to get taxed because I've had a company car. I'm going to pay tax on the equivalent of £5,000, and I'm also going to pay £2,000. I'm also going to pay tax on an additional £2,000 of fuel because my employer might have paid my fuel on my behalf. So unfortunately, even if your employer is giving you things or paying you certain benefits, you often have to pay tax on that, unfortunately. There are additional entries that you can put here. Again, comes directly from that P11D, but just to show you exactly how it's entered. And then employment expenses, for example. So remember I said you can claim certain expenses like travel. So maybe I've incurred £1,000 of travel expenses on behalf of my employer. If you do work in certain roles, you can see here, uniformed airline, helicopter pilot. Again, I've got the full video on my channel, and you can check that out to see if you're entitled to make a claim. It's not just people who are submitting tax returns. If you're an employee and you don't submit a tax return, you could potentially still make a claim as well. So make sure you go and check out that video on the channel. But you can often claim flat rate deduction. So they'll say, right, you can claim £50 a week for cleaning your uniform, for buying certain tools, that kind of thing. No questions asked. It means that you pay less tax as an employee. I'll leave that one blank here. Professional fees, subscriptions. For me, for example, as an accountant, you might pay into ACA or AAT memberships, that kind of thing. So you would enter details of any payments that you've made here. Those would be allowable expenses, and then additional expenses at the bottom. Okay, but just to show you how that information gets entered. any additional income. Usually with employment, you're not going to provide additional income. Like I say, HMRC are already aware of what's going on with your employment. So just save and continue. If you skip to the view calculation page, this is a basic summary of your calculation. It just tells you how much you need to pay and by when, on which dates. These are not my actual tax liabilities, by the way. They're just examples that I've been running through. But then at the bottom of the page, you can view and print your full calculation. So on here, you can see how this is impacting my tax liability. So I pay from employments, 35,000, which agrees to what I entered. I also entered some benefits. Remember, we had the car, £5,000. We had 2,000 of fuel benefit, and we had 500 of medical insurance. That all comes from the P11D form, and I've entered that here. And then it's deducting the £1,100 of expenses, which was £1,000 of travel expenses and £100 subscription. So that's reducing my income and reducing my liability overall. You'll also see that if you scroll to the bottom of the calculation, down here, you can see tax that's already been deducted. And they've included my £3,500 here from employment, the tax that I already paid on my employment. So they're not taxing you again on that income. They're deducting it off before the final calculation, which ensures that you aren't being taxed twice. But again, you have to include that employment income so they can then work out how much tax you need to pay on self-employed income or income from land and property like I have here. You can also see here that because my total income is £112,000, my personal allowance is being reduced. Now, normally you get a £12,000 allowance, but for every £2 over the £100,000 threshold, they take away £1 of that allowance. You can see it's been reduced down to 6,370, which again is going to increase my tax liability. And finally, if you scroll down, you'll then see how that income is actually being taxed and at what rates. And that was how to enter employment income on the self-assessment tax return. I hope you found that useful. Thank you all for watching. See you next time.